Thank you very much. And thanks very much to the festival for inviting us. I think, as you were just saying, I think there's going to be a lot of overlap, to be honest, with what Rebecca's just been saying. And I certainly think that Lux as an organisation shares many of the concerns and the practical problems, and also the kind of unusual kind of hybrid position that EAI has in the States. And I should say at this point, I think it's worth mentioning that there are kind of parallel organisations that again have differing but overlapping histories in many, particularly European countries and in Canada as well. The notes I'd made to talk about are now covered slightly unintelligibly with scribbles that I made during Rick's presentation. So I'm going to try to decipher those. I think I did make a note about how exciting it would be to have polar bears protecting our archive. I want to give you like a very brief, an extremely brief potted history of what Lux is. This is not Lux, unfortunately. This is not where I work. This is a predecessor organisation of Lux, which is the London Filmmakers Co-op. It's a very important part of the history of Lux as an organisation that it comes from a background of artist-run organisations. It starts in the 1960s. This is actually a picture from the 70s, from the mid-70s, of the Filmmakers Co-op in all its bohemian glory. The co-op started as a space for artists to screen one another's work to each other, but they also very quickly started to accrue and gather prints that they distributed so that they could make them available as widely as possible, particularly when filmmakers from the States were passing through town. In the 1970s, there was kind of half a decade later, a parallel video-based organisation sprang up that had a number of names, but eventually became London Electronic Arts. And that was doing very much the same things, but around video art. And they had a certain amount of overlap. They were in kind of parallel organisations until they were merged into Lux in the 1990s. Again, this is a very potted history that Lux was very briefly a large art centre, and it's now contracted to a small warehouse space in Dalston where we have our offices. I wanted to give you like a very brief overview of the kind of activities that we do. Again, there's going to be a certain amount of overlap with the kind of things that EAI do. So we have this collection of 5,000 films and videos. One difference with EAI is that we do have a lot of film material as well, ranging from Super 8, a lot of 16mm, some 35. We act effectively as a distributor for that collection. We also do publishing, which involves we publish DVDs, we publish books, and we do kind of online publishing, which I guess is something we'll come back to. We are increasingly actually as a kind of retailer and a wholesaler of artist DVDs published elsewhere, because that seems to be something that's of growing importance, again, as a kind of access question. We're a commissioner. We've actually just commissioned a series of films as part of something we've been doing for several years now, of commissioning 6 artist films every year that are kind of placed in cinemas before the trailers. You can actually read about one of those on the front page of our website at the moment. Oh no, it's been displaced by Laure, Prouvost, who you're going to hear from. But in one of the blog items a couple of days ago was actually about Amar Kanwar's film that we just commissioned. We do exhibition projects and touring programs, and we do educational projects as well. And we actually have an unaccredited program called the Associate Artist Program that's for 8 artists every year who work together on a kind of seminar-based program and end up doing a project together. So that's a little bit of a kind of potted overview of what we do. I think it's important just at this point to reflect a little bit on the relationship to the origins and the kind of filmmakers co-op origins that I talked about, both in terms of the similarities and the differences. I mean, one very obvious difference is that we're not really involved in production anymore. And I think this is something that Rick referred to a little bit when he talked about the kind of atomization of production, that the availability of desktop editing obviously has removed the need for people to pool resources and own the means of production in quite the way that they were talking about in the 60s and 70s. And that has, I think, very much affected the discourse as well. Artists, for example, are not being brought together in the same way and being brought into the same kind of conversations that they were when they were forced to share equipment. On the other hand, it's interesting that while that is no longer kind of aggregated function, things like archiving and distribution do still seem to be aggregated in organisations like Lux, and it'll be interesting to think about why that is. I do think it's important at this point as well to stress that Lux is not an archive, or technically it's not an archive, and the reason for that is that it's a working collection. It's a distributed collection. And we don't, for example, originally the archive didn't hold any negatives. It was really only exhibition copies of things. So it's positive prints and submasters of tapes. Now, in actual fact, that's changed over the years. And what has happened, kind of accidentally, is that as filmmakers, as it were, have disappeared, and more often the negatives have disappeared, even if they're still around, that the copies that we've held, we've kind of begun to realise are actually often do have a kind of archival status. But that was never the intention. It was very much, it's not a collection that the organisation owns. It's a service that we provide. It's about making the work as accessible as possible. And so that question of access is absolutely built into the whole structure of the organisation. That the work is holding, that the organisation is holding these works in order to make them as accessible as possible. It's not holding them for archival purposes, or not primarily. I think it's interesting actually, just on that note, I wanted to mention an artist called Malcolm LeGrice, who's one of the founding members of London Filmmakers Co-op, and you can see some. This is another kind of sister website, Lux Online, which is a kind of detailed database of British artists, film and video. He's a kind of founding father of the London Filmmakers Co-op, and one of the interesting things about Malcolm is his kind of cavalier attitude to archiving. And I did a kind of interesting interview with him a few years ago about his attitude to preservation. And he was saying that for him, preservation was very much about representation. He didn't really care that much about preserving things in their original form. And kind of apropos of that, I remember a very funny incident when he came to the office and he'd found a bunch of 16mm prints under his bed and he couldn't really remember what they were. So he was kind of looking at them on the Steenbeck and saying, "Oh, what's this? Oh, this print is really scratched. That's terrible. Oh no!" What? And then slowly it dawned on him and he said, "Oh no, this is a scratch film." And so basically there was no image in the film, and the whole, I think it's called blind white duration. The whole process of the film was that it was a blank film that accrued scratches every time it was screened, and that was the content of the film. I mean, how do you preserve that? I mean, that was we'll put that aside. But I mean, I think that's quite kind of a nice illustration of some of the kind of peculiarities of these issues in this area. I wanted to mention also this importance of access in this area. Again, the peculiarities of the questions of access in this area. I think one thing that I wanted to really stress was the kind of idea of kind of hierarchies of value, and I do think that there's a real issue about that the lack of access generates for certain kinds of work. So, for example, some of the work, the British video artist work that was made in the early 1970s by the artists who I was talking about who were involved in London Electronic Arts, is still relatively little known. And it's certainly much less well known than some of the kind of pioneering American video artists at the time that EAI still represent. And that has kind of two implications. One is that the less work is known, the less it is screened, and the less it kind of enters all kinds of different histories. And that kind of perpetuates certain kinds of art world values and hierarchies within the art forms. But the second thing is that I think there's a kind of basic question that there's a basic problem for artists who work with moving images, that they are part of art historical discourses. And in art historical discourses, it's very easy to have a kind of second-order representation of a painting or a sculpture. Even however faithful it may or may not be, people expect to be able to get some idea of something even if they haven't seen it in the flesh. Whereas obviously in a book or something, if you just see a still from a film, especially, for example, if it's a Flickr film and it's based on changing every single frame, it's completely unrepresentative. So that question of access feels like it's becoming more and more important, being able to see works in their entirety. I think what I would like to do is just skim really quickly through, just to kind of point you to the kind of different websites, because we have a couple of sister websites. So this is the main Lux website, lux.org.uk. It's got a blog. It has a kind of shop, which is where we kind of sell our DVDs and other people's. You can browse the entire collection, so you can and search the entire collection, all kind of 5,000 works and so on. You can also subscribe, which I would obviously highly recommend you do, to the monthly newswire, which has lots of information. I mean, not primarily about Lux, primarily about national and international things related to artists' moving image, whether it's festivals like this one or kind of calls and opportunities for artists to submit their work. And there is also, we are starting to put more and more of the films from the collection online, and actually not just films from the collection, but films from elsewhere that we are kind of using to contextualize works from the collection. So this is an archive. This is the kind of screening room part of the website where you can't see it very well here because of how it's stretched. But at the moment, I think as with EAI, there's a relatively small amount publicly accessible. We're starting to make more, like EAI, privately accessible for curators on a kind of on a fairly accessible but password protected URL. But this is a kind of this definitely feels like a crunch moment for these questions. It's certainly something that there's a lot of in-house discussion about for us at the moment. And yeah, if I could just point you very quickly to luxonline.org.uk, which is the, like I say, it's actually an interesting example, as a kind of side note, it's an interesting example of a kind of earlier attempt to address this issue of accessibility. This is a website that was done actually in partnership with the BFI, with Screen Online, who you're going to hear from later. It was done about 5 or 6 years ago, and in a way, it was kind of in the early days of streamed video, relatively. And so the website has a huge amount of kind of fantastic, detailed, contextual information about individual artists, also kind of curated tours of different works and so on. It does have video, but the video is mostly clips, and it's in relatively small resolution. And I think this website remains, I think, a fantastic resource, but obviously if we were revisiting it now, we would very much be thinking in terms of having a lot more moving image. And I would point you just quickly to 2 other sites. The Keep Moving Image site, which is a kind of sub-site of lux.org.uk, which is about preservation and preservation of artist moving image. And actually that interview with Malcolm LeGrice is on there. And this, the crammy.lux.org.uk, is actually a curatorial resource. So again, it's a kind of it's supposed to be a first port of call for people doing research into sourcing works for exhibition, not just from Lux, but from all these kind of all the other kind of possible sources. I think there's one other thing that I'd like to add at this point, and just I think in terms of the kind of the most progressive discussion that's been going on, actually, in a way, in this area is actually still being led by the artists. And actually, I think the most interesting contribution is actually an artist who's very close to EAI, which is Seth Price. Now, he wrote a text which some of you may be familiar with, called Dispersion. It's been a kind of much discussed text in the last couple of years. You can download it free from his website, which is very much the point. And it's about the idea. He starts with a quote from Marcel Boutaz saying, "The definition of artistic activity occurs first of all in the field of distribution." And it's very much about this idea. It's very much about the idea of thinking of works primarily in terms of the way they're disseminated, rather than in terms of their content, for example. And it's very provocative. It leaves a lot of unanswered questions, but I think in a way, it's probably a kind of fantastic starting point in a way for anyone that's wanting to look at these issues. And like I say, it's freely downloadable from his site. And I do think that just to conclude, and to refer back a little bit to something Rebecca was saying. The one kind of note of caution I would say is, obviously we're very keen to put as much work online as possible, but I think that the question that comes up for us again and again is this question of context. And what the internet, it seems to me anyways, often does, it's a kind of great leveler. It's a kind of, in a way, it's a bit like a kind of living embodiment of Roland Barthes' Death of the Author. It's the kind of destruction of every author, of every point of origin. And that has very interesting effects, but it has a kind of very leveling effect. And what I think is interesting is, I think you could make a case that, and this would be a kind of crucial dividing line, I think, between contemporary art practice and contemporary film practice. I think for a lot of contemporary art practice, context is the key question. And every time you have to think about putting work online, releasing into this environment, or releasing it into any environment through publishing or DVDs or whatever, this question of context occurs and recurs. And I think in some ways that's a less of a charged question for certain, let's for the sake of argument call them kind of filmmakers. But I do think for contemporary artists, and this is something that very much comes up in the Seth Price text, it's a kind of urgent question. And I think it's in some ways, in more kind of reactionary arguments, often it certainly does get framed in terms of scarcity, as Rebecca was saying, about the need to kind of restrict access. But I actually think it's not, I think there's a more progressive way of reading that as well, that it's not simply about economic value, but it's about cultural economies, and about the need of artists to maintain a kind of level of control about the way in which their work is framed, or about their desire to do that. And I think that's a more complicated question. But I think that's probably enough from me. So thank you very much.